There's an animal shelter crisis in the U.S., and it's being caused by the so-called no-kill shelter advocates. Find out about the group that's destroying sheltering in America. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights. Brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, exposing the group known as Best Friends Animal Society and their advocacy for controversial no-kill policies. Feels good, sounds good, but not nearly as effective as good old-fashioned sheltering combined with mandatory spay-neuter laws. PETA has now compiled the facts about the group Best Friends Animal Society on our website. Daphna Nachminovich, PETA Senior VP on Cruelty Investigations, says we're at a critical point. My conversation with Daphna on this edition of the PETA Podcast with Emil Guillermo.
This is really important information for people to know.
Daphna, thank you for being part of the PETA Podcast. We always like to talk to you.
My pleasure.
So this is an unusual thing because you are going after a group called Best Friends. Tell me about Best Friends and how they are so associated with the no-kill movement in the United States.
So this is an organization called Best Friends Animal Society. It's based in Utah, and its last reported annual revenue was $173 million. And Best Friends began with a sanctuary in Utah that shelters a relatively small number of animals. But in recent years, it has infiltrated, or using its own term, embedded in a variety of animal shelters across the country. And it purports to be able to achieve, and has for years and years, the goal of no kill by year X. The last year that they've cited is 2025, which we are in right now. I think one of their slogans is "Save them all," and they purport to will have achieved this goal by 2025, which will come and go without the goal being achieved, because the claim that we can stop euthanasia in our nation's shelters is not based on any kind of reality. And what we are exposing with this web feature is very serious. You know, these are specific examples, case examples of this organization causing harm to animals and fooling kind people who want to support good work and are rightfully and understandably attracted to the notion that euthanasia will be a thing of the past in animal shelters. But obviously PETA has its own outlook on this, which lies in prevention of unwanted births, and that we are not going to be able to stop needless euthanasia in animal shelters until we control the influx of animals into a world already bursting at the seams with unwanted ones.
But this is important for people to know that Best Friends is this advocacy group, a huge budget, you said 173 million. I didn't realize how big it was. But they are the leading advocates of the no-kill movement. And this web feature that you're doing, tell me what you're exposing. Why is no-kill such a bad idea? Because people, when they hear it at first, they're attracted to it. They say, no-kill, this sounds like our way out. This sounds like the answer. But why isn't it the answer?
Right. So this is a very complicated issue for people because it sounds so lovely to say no-kill. I will say that a growing number of organizations also condemns the term because it's so divisive, and what it has led to is people terming certain shelters, quote unquote, kill shelters, which is a horrible, offensive term, very destructive, very damaging to the good people who work in animal shelters and have to carry out euthanasia. So yes, Best Friends has become the leader. There are other advocacy groups. Best Friends is a pressure group. Essentially, they bully, they get into a community, and if the public officials, the elected officials, and the animal shelter workers don't bend to their will, they will keep the pressure up via social media. They incite an atmosphere of resentment and hate towards the people who work in open admission animal shelters. And they use this very appealing slogan that sounds wonderful to all of us, but in fact is not realistic and not, I'm so sorry to say right now, not possible.
And tell me why no kill doesn't work, because I know we've had conversations in the past, but a lot of people new to this and who are just paying attention to this are scratching their head saying, yeah, if we can avoid killing animals, isn't that the best answer?
So it sounds wonderful, but the way that you achieve it right now in this day and age, and what Best Friends policies that they push call for, is essentially keeping animals out of shelters in order to keep so-called live release rates high, to keep so-called euthanasia rates low. And even an opinion piece by their CEO that appeared recently says, quote, keeping pets out of shelters should be a first choice management protocol. So this philosophy, this push for keeping animals out of shelters, because if they do go into open admission shelters that perform euthanasia, there is a chance they would be euthanized if they are not adoptable or not adopted. This philosophy, they have pressured shelters across the nation to embrace this philosophy. And what it has done is deprived countless animals and the people who care about them of desperately needed help.
Well, what does it mean, though, to say keep them out of shelters? If you keep them out of shelters, do they just go roaming free out in the community? What does it mean to say, when the no-kill movement says keep them out of shelters?
All right, so that's a great question because it's done in various ways. One is what's called managed intake. So it's an appointment-based system. There are, all of a sudden there are admission fees. There are new policies that keep most cats out of the shelter. People are turned away if they don't have an appointment. Most appointments, typically in my experience, are weeks or months away. They encourage people to keep and harbor stray animals they find, even if it's temporarily, which not only is a potential liability to the locality where this happens, but deprives the guardian of a potentially genuinely lost animal of the opportunity to quickly be reunited with their animal. They instruct people to leave animals on the streets, and they shift the animal care and control responsibilities onto the public. That's the example I just gave with keeping strays. They advocate for abandoning cats outdoors, leaving cats outdoors, leaving kittens outdoors, discouraging people from rescuing kittens who were born unwanted to a free-roaming cat outside. Removing all barriers to adoptions. So essentially they put barriers to surrender, right? It's almost impossible to surrender an animal to the shelter, but they advocate for indiscriminate placement of animals. So they will give animals away for free, and they will give animals away for $1. They will simplify or eliminate any screening attempt, checking if the landlord allows animals, veterinary checks and references on animals you have at home. There was an incident in Indianapolis in the last year where 2 workers got fired because they were using a background check system that they had started using when an animal they placed in a home from Indianapolis, the city shelter, got tortured and killed within 9 days of adoption. And a couple of years passed, and these 2 young women who kept using this background check system, at the recommendation of Best Friends, the shelter stopped doing that, and 2 people who were still doing it got fired. So this gives you an idea of the tactics of keeping certain statistics low.
Well, it sounds like a manipulation. If you limit the number of animals that go in and you let them go out freely without any kind of checks, then the numbers are lower. But why isn't that good for the animals? Because it sounds like they've sort of come up with some formula that would reduce the number of animals that would have to face euthanasia. But why isn't that a good thing for the animals?
simplest answer is that it doesn't save anybody, because those animals actually don't get help. They still die. They get abandoned outside, the face of violent, prolonged, and agonizing death. Euthanasia in an animal shelter is by far not the worst thing that can happen to an animal. And a life at any cost is not the philosophy that we believe in. This sort of rabid no-kill mentality where anything is better than a humane death has led to prolonged, agonizing deaths and suffering, and in fact, more animals having babies out on the street. So it's fooling people. It is manipulation. It is a shell game. It would be the same as a cancer center, only admitting patients that they have a good chance of curing, not admitting terminal patients, and then saying, look how many patients we have saved.
That's a great
You
analogy.
didn't take in the ones who were terminal, so of course you didn't save them. So it's not really, I mean, it certainly is a formula, except that it leaves out a massive part of the equation, because there is no tracking of the animals who are turned away. There's no tracking of the calls from people who say, I need help, and who are told, sorry, we're full. There's no tracking of that. There are no statistics of that. Yeah. But what we are seeing is, especially in our neck of the woods in Virginia, where our Department of Agriculture tracks these things, including the rate of unassisted deaths, animals dying alone in a cage without the dignity of euthanasia, often without veterinary care, we have seen an increase in the rate of unassisted deaths, animals suffering and dying, versus the rate of animals euthanized. So when you look at the shelter statistics, those unassisted deaths, which are marked as died in custody, are not actually really counted towards the live release or euthanasia rates. It's all just a game. It's a lie. It's a facade, and it fools the public.
Yeah, and this, you've described the modus operandi of best friends. Is this the way all no-kill shelters are run? Because when I hear of no-kill shelters, usually the problem is they have a storage problem, because if they can't kill or they can't humanely put to death animals, then they end up storing these animals, and they have no room, and so they end up nullifying any kind of help that they can give to the public or to the animals.
Right. And we use the word euthanize because obviously, this is nobody wants to do it. I started in this field in the early 90s, and I never thought that that was something that I would learn how to do. And I gradually sort of came to understand that for some animals, that was the most humane outcome, given the neglect and abuse that they had suffered, and the fact that nobody was going to take on the behavioral challenges that they presented as a result of that abuse and neglect. And it takes a piece of you away every time. It's a very difficult task. And so we take our hats off to the people who perform that sad task. We know it's difficult. We see you, and we want you to know that we are telling people about the tactics of best friends, because they vilify and demonize these shelters and the shelter workers that work there. And they really fool the public into thinking that the shelter is euthanizing animals because it wants to. Shelters are not breeding animals. Shelters are not causing the problem, unless, of course, they are doing things that Best Friends recommends, which really increases the amount of suffering. So it sounds really good, but it's deception, and it tells the other very dangerous part of this that I think is super important is that it sends a message to the public that there isn't a problem and they don't need to change their behaviors. The reality is we are in a massive overpopulation and homelessness crisis. And if you care about this, you have to spay or neuter your animals. You must never buy from a breeder. You must never buy from a pet shop. You must help everyone you know spay or neuter. Care about this. Take action. If you tell people that the local shelter is not euthanizing anymore, what that tells them is that, great, there's not a problem anymore. Society has licked this problem. We are very far from there. We are farther from there than we've been in a very long time. And part of that is because of no-kill policies.
And when you mention this, and where Best Friends Animal Society, where they go and try to impose their will, and they bully shelters. We're talking about public taxpayer-funded animal shelters, making this really a public crisis, a community crisis. And
100%.
Is Best Friends getting away with this? Their bullying tactics?
Yes, they have been. They absolutely have been. And you know who hasn't been getting away with things is animals. Animals are suffering the consequences. And we know this from our very own hometown. The policies have changed. Essentially, free roaming cats over 16 weeks of age are not accepted by the shelter. What does that mean? It means PETA's shelter gets more calls. It means PETA's shelter euthanasia rates are higher because they take in the animals who are not getting help from the taxpayer-funded shelters. And it means that we're getting calls from taxpayers who are extremely frustrated because their neighborhood is overrun with cats, or their raccoons are being attracted to feeding stations. And they are desperate. We're talking to one woman who has to get allergy shots quarterly now because of her neighbor who puts food out, and there are no consequences whatsoever. And the bottom line is that the animals are suffering the price. She has found dead kittens in her yard. She found a dead cat who was run over in somebody's driveway. The animals are not saved. They die. They just die badly and violently.
So what should, communities do when they see best friends coming in, bullying their city councils and their, the boards of supervisors, or, whatever the legislative body is locally? What do you suggest to communities in that case?
Well, I think that's why this feature is so important, is because it lays out examples of communities that have stood up to best friends. If you watch the North Little Rock testimony and people from the local shelter, one after the other, testifying to their city council members about why it would be a terrible idea to let best friends in, and urging them with success to keep best friends out of the community. This feature was put up to educate people, both in positions, elected officials, as well as taxpayers, on how these policies impact animals and what these policies actually mean, because they don't mean anybody is saved. They simply mean that somebody isn't part of the intake column. If you don't take them in and they're not adoptable, you don't have to count them. And I want to also add that one of the policies that we've seen them advocate is to stop with temperament testing of potentially aggressive dogs, or all dogs, which means that, and you'll see on that webpage, that there are lawsuits because people have been harmed and even killed by animals who were adopted from shelters with no-kill policies. And this is another sort of big picture harm that comes, is that people then are turned off by the idea of adopting. And that prompts them to go buy an animal, which in the big picture really does a lot of harm. We always say one of our biggest campaigns is adopt, don't shop, never buy. And that's, that message is out the window with these policies.
So tell me more about Best Friends, because your web feature, which people can access and see for themselves, but you go into the background of Best Friends, the Best Friends Animal Society. What did PETA find out?
Well, this is from FBI records. This started as a cult many years ago, and it's a sort of secondary issue to what's happening today. But what is happening today is not unlike a cult and a cult following, because I think people love the message, and I would too if I didn't know any better. But I think what we need to remember is that animals depend on us, and quality of life is where we focus, not just quantity of life. An animal does not have a life if they're kept at the end of a chain, or in a pen alone outdoors, or if they're in a cage, as you said, warehoused by a facility with no-kill policies. Warehousing animals just to keep them alive does not do them any favors. Just like us, they're individuals with personalities and needs. They need to exercise. They need companionship. They need a family. And we have created this crisis. We have created this problem. So as the people responsible for the problem, it's also our responsibility to fix it humanely and responsibly, and to hold people accountable when they are inhumane, when they're cruel. But instead, these no-kill policies are keeping animals out of shelters, are in fact, as you say, causing overcrowding. We have case after case, animals killing each other, being put in a kennel when they don't know each other because there's overcrowding. All of the policies all of us have worked so hard to implement to keep animals safe and sheltered have sort of gone out the window with this push.
So if people live in communities and they hear that Best Friends is coming into their city council to talk and trying to take over their shelter, what do you suggest that people do? First of all, maybe they should see the web feature, but what are the steps that people should take?
Well, they should contact us because we can help. We can try to help stop that. So they can absolutely email PETA through our website. And they should look at the feature and educate themselves and educate their public officials because there are very specific case examples of what has happened in various communities, what's happening in communities that have implemented no-kill policies, such as those pushed by Best Friends, and how animals have been harmed and how people have been harmed. So I think educating yourself on the reality of what all this means once you penetrate the good sounding words is the number one thing you can do. And then we can help you if you contact us. We will absolutely hold your hand and guide you.
And what can people do just if there's no best friends coming into their community, they have a regular shelter. What are some of the standard things that people can do to try to fight the overpopulation problem when it comes to our companion animals?
That's a great question. So the number one thing, of course, is spay neuter, spay neuter, spay neuter, spay neuter, and never buy. Don't shop at pet shops. Don't buy from breeders, and don't think that just because it's one animal, it doesn't make a difference, because it does. So every single animal who's purchased is an animal who has not been adopted. Volunteer at your local shelter. Urge your public officials, your elected officials, to keep your local taxpayer-funded shelter open admission, meaning they take in all comers. Anybody who needs help should get help. That's the definition of shelter. A shelter should shelter. A shelter should take animals in and serve as a safe haven. Instead, Best Friends has turned the dialogue around so that people look at a shelter as a negative thing. A shelter should be supported by the community. The community should support its shelter, volunteer at the shelter, fundraise for the shelter, hold adoption events, do all the things that we used to do before Best Friends. And that sort of pressure mentality to just keep animals out of the shelter at all costs became the priority. We want to focus on quality of life and good policies.
Yeah, and since Best Friends has come onto the scene, I mean, they said that they were going to end this problem, and by 2025, we still have the problem. But we have a number of big cities, small cities that have gone the Best Friends route, and it has not been good, right?
No, it has been a disaster. In fact, Best Friends was itself in charge in Los Angeles for a period of time. Los Angeles remains a disaster, overpopulation, animals being turned away, barriers to surrender, dogs in kennels who are not being walked, volunteers being mauled. I mean, the list goes on. Austin, which is often held as this mecca of no-kill, is actually a disaster, with a city council member saying she wouldn't wish conditions that she saw for animals there on her worst enemies. Their own city council members saying this. All of these examples are on our website. So it's really vital that people just know what all of this means. I think that's where the confusion has happened, is that the terms sound really good, but nobody understands what they actually mean. And there's no tracking of who's turned away and what happens to them. But open admission shelters see that firsthand. They see who's turned away when they come to their doorstep after being turned away, and they see, what has happened.
And it's really something when people think about animal rights and animal protection. I mean, this is really one of the basic issues in the movement. What do we do with our companion animals and sheltering? Where would you say we are in terms of how we've progressed, or how we've taken a step back?
I mean, that's a very complicated question, because one of the big shortcomings is that government officials have not really, in most places, dedicated funding and budgeting to spay neuter and spay neuter accessibility, and we have a veterinary workforce shortage that makes accessibility even harder. But I can tell you that we are not ahead of where we were before Best Friends. We were making headway because we were spaying and neutering every animal before they left the shelter, something that Best Friends now tells shelters, if you need to get them out the door intact, you go ahead. It's better that they're out the door. They oppose mandatory spay-neuter ordinances when those could save lives if they're enforced. There's no focus on prevention and spay-neuter. It's sort of an afterthought. The only focus that they have is, the intake and the statistics. Animals are not numbers. Animals are individuals with personalities and needs. And it is soul-crushing when you see an animal who's been bounced around for years and is completely confused Just because they're stoic and they can manage sometimes in a shelter environment does not mean that that does not damage them. So in the big picture of things, without the community's help, we can't continue to make headway. We need to be able to count on our public to understand that spay-neuter is the answer, prevention is the answer, banning the sale of puppies and kittens and other animals in pet shops is the answer. That's how we're going to stop this crisis. But this crisis is nowhere near its end point. Shelters are struggling more than ever right now.
And a big step toward trying to move in the right direction is getting information out to the public, getting people informed. And this web series that you have, this web feature on PETA.org, sounds like it's going to be a very important step for people.
I hope so. I hope people take a look at it and they get out of it what they can, even if you read it in small portions. This is information that's factual, is well sourced. All the links are in there. And this is information that you need to know about an organization that purports to do good, but in fact is causing great harm to the animals we love and care about so much.
And what's the website again? Is it on PETA.org in general?
Yes, it's on PETA.org.
Okay.
Indeed.
Well, Daphna, always great talking to you about, all the problems that you're trying to solve there in Virginia. Really, I hope, we've talked about no kill before, but clearly we have to do more. People have to understand what it means and why no kill is, what
a sham.
It's a sham, yeah.
And I would also encourage people to remember, please don't use the word kill or kill shelter. These are words that are devastating to hear when you work in this field and euthanasia is on your job description. Nobody works at an animal shelter because they want to euthanize. Most people work in animal shelters because they care about animals. And having to do that, it's easy to point a finger and judge, and it's easy to say, I could never do what you do. But you could trust me when I tell you that it's much harder when you fed that animal and walked that animal. You saw the person who abandoned that animal. You've been taking care of that animal. And it's between, it's hard already to reach the conclusions and the difficult decisions that we have to reach. We don't need the extra finger pointing from best friends or anybody else.
Daphna Nachminovich, thank you.
Thank you.
Daphna Nachminovich, PETA's Senior VP of Cruelty Investigations, on why no kill should be a no-go in your area. Instead, spay and neuter your animals and never buy from breeders. Cat and dog overpopulation is a problem, but we can overcome it with humane, common sense practices. Go to PETA.org for more details on how best friends, bullies, local communities to adopt no-kill shelter philosophies that do more harm to animals than good. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA Podcast. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on X, that's aka Twitter, at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK. See me at AMOK.com or find this podcast on YouTube at Emil Amok 1. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to as well as rate and review the show. It really does help get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbonworks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.